Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Viking guest lecture. My name's Patrick Jephson. Imagine I've seen many of you on board on various cruises, and it's really nice to be able to speak to more of you this way. Today's topic is the Jubilee and beyond. What next for the Windsors? 2022 is a big year for the House of Windsor. Queen Elizabeth's 70th year on the throne, and the country is celebrating her Platinum Jubilee. It's a unique achievement. She is the longest serving British head of state, and she has served through the tenure, for example, of 13 US presidents. Every US president since Truman, and she's had 170 prime ministers in her various realms and territories around the world. It's an extraordinary record of achievement. But we open with this photograph of the royal family on the balcony at Buckingham Palace. This is perhaps the most familiar image we have of them. It has very powerful symbolic value. It shows the lucky subjects of the United Kingdom and the other realms and territories that the Queen is alive and well, and she's surrounded by her family, and that the monarchy is in safe hands. It's not going to run out of people anytime soon. However, it is also, these days, an opportunity, a bit like watching the Kremlin in the old days of May Day parades. Who's in, who's out? Who's going to be there next time? Who's missing? And if we look at this photograph, we can see several characters there who are unlikely to be there again. Prince Andrew, obviously, and towards the back, Harry and Meghan. Big question mark over their future role. And indeed, in some quarters, a question mark over the future viability of the monarchy, when inevitably, as it must, Queen Elizabeth's reign comes to an end. So we've got lots to look at. And I should perhaps just explain, for those who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting on board, just why I'm talking about this subject. So this photograph shows me, I have to say, a younger and slimmer me, with my boss, Princess Diana. For 8 years, I was the princess's equerry and private secretary, which roughly equates to chief of staff. And this meant that I was in charge of every aspect of her public life. In the words of David Putnam, the great film producer, he said, I was the producer of the Diana show. It meant that everything that went well was credit to her, and if anything went less well, that was probably down to me. So we had a very exciting 8 years. It was a great privilege for me, and a lot of fun a lot of the time, traveling around the world and helping the princess prepare for what was to be her role as the next queen consort. Sadly, as we know, that was not to be. But here you see me doing one of my favorite things, with the princess about to get on the Concorde to fly to America. And that was one of the many wonderful perks of my job. It could be quite stressful at times too, particularly since the period of my tenure covered the final failure of the Wales's marriage, formal separation, divorce proceedings, and Princess Diana's embarkation on a sort of solo royal career, which was professionally very challenging for me, but it had its tense moments. That's where I grew a few of those grey hairs. But as we know, the British monarchy has as its great strength the fact that it goes on and on. It is a wonderful example of continuity. It provides national continuity. But one of the best ways to see what might be coming in the future is to look back. So let's spend a minute or two just looking at a little bit of history. I'm actually now a naturalized American, so from the perspective of the western side of the Atlantic, I find it very interesting to look at the British monarchy as an institution in an American context. You've probably recognized this chap. This is Thomas Jefferson, and he famously said about the monarchy, there is not a single crowned head in Europe whose talents or merit would entitle him to be elected a vestryman by the people of any parish in America. That's pretty damning comment. They wouldn't even be elected vestrymen. And of course, the reality is royal people are not elected. They are what they are by virtue of their birth. So it's the very antithesis of the great American belief that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The mere existence of monarchy is an assertion that all men are not created equal. And indeed, that very point was put to the test in England in the 17th century. England had its own civil war, which resulted in the defeat of the royalist forces under King Charles I, and the poor old king got his head chopped off in January 1649 outside the Palace of Whitehall. And next time you're in London, you're walking down Whitehall towards the Houses of Parliament, you walk right past the spot where the scaffold was erected for his execution. And there followed a period of essentially Republican rule. It was called the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell. And his statue, almost as an act of defiance, is the one you see actually right next to the Palace of Westminster. He embodied a particular style of Republican rule, Puritan, rather joyless. And maybe it was that, or maybe it was just the fact that the British people, the English people, wanted something with a little more continuity in it, that they decided to restore the monarchy in 1660. Charles II, the Merry Monarch, restored the monarchy, and the monarchy has never been overthrown ever since. Because it seems a constitutional monarchy works well for the United Kingdom and for quite a few other countries too. And it's just an important little detail here, but for those who aren't familiar with the British Constitution, the monarch is, of course, the head of state, not the head of government. Unlike here in America, where the head of state and head of government roles are combined in the form of the president. So the job of actually running the country is given to the Prime Minister, and he wields, or she wields, executive power as head of Her Majesty's government. The Prime Minister exercises authority on behalf of the sovereign, and therefore the British government is known as Her Majesty's government. And if you get a tax demand, it'll be from Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. And if you sign up to serve in the military, you serve in Her Majesty's Armed Forces, and if you're in the Navy, you serve in Her Majesty's ships. And in Parliament, of course, it doesn't just it's not just the government that belongs to the Queen. The opposition is Her Majesty's loyal opposition. So the monarchy wins both ways, and it reminds the politicians that they don't really rule the roost. They may have the power temporarily, but it is the monarch who is the source of all legitimate authority. Just looking ahead here to a famous photograph, this is VE Day in London, that same balcony. And here we see George VI and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, flanked by their daughters, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, and in the middle, the Prime Minister, Churchill. Normally, politicians don't get to go on the Buckingham Palace balcony. They made an exception for this Prime Minister, given, I suppose, his extraordinary record of service during World War II. Churchill, not just a historian, but also a constitutional commentator, and he described the British constitutional arrangement as a crowned republic. Now, this is his words: "In our island, by trial and error, and by perseverance across the centuries, we have found a very good plan. Here it is. The Queen can do no wrong, but advisers can be changed as often as the people like to use their right for that purpose." Now, the Prime Minister is the monarch's senior advisor. And as Churchill says, the people can change the Prime Minister whenever they want, whenever they vote to do so. And he was more aware than most of the value of this setup. If you've ever seen The King's Speech, the movie, or Darkest Hour, you see something of the relationship between the monarch and the Prime Minister. That continues to this day, with the Prime Minister going every week to report to the Queen, and as a result, the Queen, as you can imagine, after 13 prime ministers, has been privy to some extraordinary secrets. She is, by this stage, the mother of the nation. And as Churchill said, the monarch can do no wrong. Being a queen who can do no wrong, having this aura of infallibility, is very rare and very precious. She also commands now unconditional public affection. And big question whether that aura of infallibility and that unconditional affection will transfer to her heirs. That is really the critical question that faces the future of the British monarchy. But back to this year, the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. Big celebrations planned, and it'll be next weekend, June the 2nd, 3rd, 4th and 5th. Extra long holiday in the UK, and it's going to provide time for a wonderful programme of celebrations. There will be the famous Trooping the Colour parade at Horse Guards. There will be a Royal Air Force flypast. There will be a chain of Jubilee beacons right across the country. On Friday, June the 3rd, there will be a service of thanksgiving for the Queen's reign at St. Paul's Cathedral. And that, incidentally, is where it's expected that Harry and Meghan and Prince Andrew will appear with the rest of the royal family in a private capacity. It's a family occasion, not technically a public one. Big question is whether the Queen will be there. She has been suffering mobility issues of late, and she is unlikely to go up the front steps of St. Paul's, more likely some comfortable way in through the side. We hope she's there. Then on Saturday, very much to the Queen's taste, there will be the Derby at Epsom Downs, big horse race. And in the evening, a huge Platinum Jubilee party at Buckingham Palace with lots of famous stars. Diana Ross, Queen, Duran Duran, and lots of others that I don't recognize. And then finally, on Sunday, June the 5th, a big party in the parks around Buckingham Palace, a picnic and a big parade, a pageant, 5,000 people. If you're in London, it's going to be a really wonderful celebration. Of course, some of us are old enough to remember earlier Jubilees. This is the first one that I was able to enjoy, 1977, the Silver Jubilee, the year I left college. So it was a summer of great celebrations. Also the summer I graduated from the Naval College. Look at that, that's me in 1977. Not sure I could squeeze into that uniform anymore. But it does go to show that it's just an example, really, of in Britain how people measure their own lives against the lives of the royal family. The royal family has the function, not official, but it works this way, as acting as a kind of national family, that people can project their own experiences onto royal people, that people's own lives are lived out through the lives of the royal family. That's usually a pretty healthy thing. Not always. There are aspects of the royal family's life that have become too well known, perhaps, to the rest of us. But even then, it's reassuring, I suppose, to think that they're human like the rest of us. They, of course, have the benefit of this extraordinary lineage. Here's one of the most famous, King Henry VIII. Anybody who's seen the Tudors or other historic movies about that period know what an extraordinary impact he had on the history of the British throne, particularly the split with Rome, the establishment of the Church of England, dissolution of the monasteries, and really a kind of Brexit for its own time, breaking away from continental power. And just as a point of minor interest, an ancestor of mine, Henry Norris, served the king as a courtier, and for his pains got executed because the king thought that he was having an affair with Anne Boleyn. And before that, my family had had a role in the courts of Henry III, and afterwards Elizabeth I, William III, and more recently, obviously, Elizabeth II. Henry VIII significant for some Viking voyages because the getting off point for London is Tilbury, and Tilbury Fort was built by Henry VIII, and it was visited famously by Elizabeth I when she was rallying the country against the threat of the Spanish Armada. She said, "I may have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." And she, perhaps along with the present Elizabeth, bookends a particularly glorious period in the history of the British monarchy. The other great female figure, of course, in that time was Queen Victoria, and until recently, she was the longest reigning British monarch. She was the Empress of India. She was grandmother of Tsar Nicholas and Kaiser Wilhelm. In many ways, she was the grandmother of Europe. There wasn't a European royal family that wasn't in some way related to Queen Victoria. And indeed, to this day, the monarchies of the UK and Norway, this being Viking.TV, are very closely related. Queen Elizabeth is second cousin to King Harold of Norway. The beginning of the 20th century saw the reign of Queen Victoria's son, Edward VII, and she really despaired over him. He was a bit of a ne'er-do-well in many ways. He had a reputation as a terrible womanizer, obviously liked eating and drinking too, quite the party animal. And on the right is his long-suffering queen, Queen Alexandra, Alex, as she was known. Big favorite of mine, actually. My office at the palace, when I was working for Princess Diana, was adorned with a portrait of Princess Alexandra when she was Princess of Wales. And so I spent 8 years under her unblinking blue gaze. Fascinating character, not really sufficiently explored or understood, but it's safe to say that she pioneered a lot of modern concepts for the monarchy because her marriage was not happy and she threw herself into royal charity work. Remind you of anyone? There are many parallels between Queen Alexandra and Princess Diana. They were followed by George V and Queen Mary. Just look at Queen Mary's posture there. And it reminds us that very often it was the women of the dynasty who gave the Windsors their backbone. Very, very often it's the women who have kept the show on the road and shown the kind of grit and determination and wider understanding that very often the menfolk have lacked. Good example here, Edward VIII, the king who abdicated in 1936. This is an unusual image of him because he's wearing coronation robes, and of course he was never actually crowned. He abdicated before the coronation ceremony and went into exile, and has been a cautionary tale to the Windsors ever since. His time in exile was controversial. There was rather a lot of this kind of thing, and it did also put under the spotlight the fact that he had married an American divorcee. Of course, Meghan Markle, the next American divorcee to marry into the House of Windsor, and hopefully she will have a happier experience than Wallis Simpson, because she and Edward VIII ended up being rather aimless. They drifted around the world, and always under the shadow of criticism from home, and indeed persistent rumors of treason during World War II. This is the antithesis, the antidote, in a way, to those rumors. Here is the present Queen as Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret. Princess Elizabeth aged 14, Princess Margaret aged 10, speaking on the radio during Children's Hour, speaking to the children of the Empire. And that's a lovely broadcast if you get the chance to hear it. "Come on, Margaret," says the Queen. Only a few years later, the Queen was old enough to join the army, served in uniform, and just on a personal note, so did my mother. Wore this uniform very much the same age as the Queen, rather looked like the Queen too. And that's just an example of the way in which many people, particularly I suppose of my generation, grew up thinking of the Queen as a kind of super mum. Talking of super mums, here is Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, who was in many ways, the strength behind the reign of King George VI. George VI, as you know, if you've seen the King's speech, had a speech impediment, didn't expect or want to take the throne, but having had it thrust upon him, served it heroically during the war and increasingly in ill health, and the strength and determination of his wife, Queen Elizabeth, obviously key to the success of his reign. And her role, her invisible role, or unmeasurable role, as the impetus behind morale on the home front, very hard to measure. She said when Buckingham Palace was bombed, she said, "Good, now we can look the East End in the eye." The East End, the docks, which were very heavily bombed, very wisely seeing that the royal family had to be seen to be suffering in the war alongside their people. Relationship, of course, between Princess Elizabeth and her father, very close. This photograph was taken at the time of her 21st birthday, when she famously spoke to the empire and dedicated her whole life, be it long or short, to your service. And that is a vow that she has upheld magnificently ever since. She gave that vow at the age of 21. By the age of 25, she was queen. And it's perhaps a contrast that we can come back to later, the contrast of a young, vulnerable female queen against the prospects for the new monarch in this century. Not young, not vulnerable, not female, and therefore, in a sense, at a disadvantage when it comes to enlisting public support. Shortly after the end of the war, Princess Elizabeth married Prince Philip of Greece, and he was regarded initially as a bit of a penniless Greek playboy, but the love was true and withstood the test of time. They were married in 1947. It was a kind of signal of the good times returning after the privations of World War II. Even so, the Queen's wedding dress was purchased with clothing coupons. Interesting point there, you see Prince Philip still only a lieutenant, 2 stripes on his arm, yet a chest full of medals, all of them earned, and the highest decorations, honors that the king could bestow. A modest man and a man of great achievement. And we'll look a little further at his life and funeral in a moment. Very quickly, there was an heir, Prince Charles, and here in this photograph we see 3 queens, Mary, Elizabeth, and the other Elizabeth, and 1 future king. So here's the Queen when she became queen, still only 25, but look at that expression, every inch ahead of state. And what a state. In 1952, these were the realms and territories over which she reigned, still a very substantial chunk of the world. And this more formal photograph of the Queen and Prince Philip was the kind of thing that you would find in offices' messes or government buildings all over the world. But the Queen, of course, always recognizing the need to carry on the dynasty, in educating Prince Charles in his future duties as king. He has had to serve a very long apprenticeship, the longest. He served as the longest heir in history. Edward VII used to say, while waiting for his chance to be king, that unlike the rest of the country, he prayed to the Eternal Mother. Prince Charles maybe could be forgiven for thinking the same. He's had to wait a very long time he has turned that weight into a lot he's achieved an enormous amount of good things and has arguably therefore become the best qualified king in waiting we've ever had. During the 60s, there was an attempt to make the royal family less remote. It was considered to be rather unwise, but they let the cameras in to see the royal family behind the scenes. I can remember as a young boy seeing this on TV and being amazed. Here was the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh and the princes and Princess Anne, all behaving, it seemed like an ordinary family. Barbecuing in the garden, going about their normal family life. It made them very accessible, but it was considered to be a failure, a little bit too accessible maybe. And this program was never shown again. Fast forward to the wedding of Prince Charles and Princess Diana. It's easy to forget that Princess Diana didn't marry into the royal family to be Princess Diana. She married into it one day to be Queen Consort. And that was what I expected, like the rest of the country, when I watched the wedding in 1981. This wonderful image of the dutiful, handsome prince and his very beautiful young wife. I remember thinking, that's fantastic. That's the whole future of the monarchy settled for the rest of my life. What can possibly go wrong? And unfortunately, fate had other plans, but that's the way it was. And that's how it looked in 1981. The whole family gathered in support, and the monarchy appeared to be set for the foreseeable future, especially when Prince William was born. Compare this with the previous image of the three queens. Well, two queens and a woman who expected at this stage that she would be queen as well. The marriage looked great on the outside. It provided all the reassurance that the country needed. This meant that the continuity of the monarchy was in safe hands. And that image was reinforced by this sort of picture, the happy family picture, including the Jack Russell Tigger, a favorite. William and Harry, too, very noisy and fun-loving little boys. They were great fun. And even then, it was time, Princess Diana thought, for them to learn not how to be normal people, because they never could be, having been born royal, but they could at least understand what life was like for normal people. So pretty soon she started taking them to the cinema, to McDonald's, and then to homeless shelters, so that they learned what their future royal lives would be like. And as we know, the marriage went from bad to worse. I can tell you from the inside, these were very stressful times indeed, and very upsetting, because these were real people who we worked with every day and had great respect and in some ways affection for them too. And ultimately, the bad news got worse, and Charles and Diana divorced. And then, just when you thought it couldn't get even worse, Princess Diana, as we know, died in a car crash in Paris. And this was a sort of crisis for the monarchy, and yet, in a sense, also a rebirth. The few days before Princess Diana's funeral were very tense ones for the monarchy. I can remember going down to Buckingham Palace the evening before the funeral, and it was a very warm summer's night. Thousands of people had gathered at the palace, and yet there was hardly a sound. It was rather an ominous atmosphere. There was grief, but there was also something not quite right. And it wasn't until the Queen and the rest of the royal family returned to London from their holiday in Scotland that it seemed that the Queen had reasserted herself, not just her authority as head of state, but, as she said in her speech, as a grandmother too. Since then, the monarchy has been going through smoother waters, and here we see this enchanting photograph of the Queen with her great-grandchildren. And through it all, the man she described as her staff and stay, Prince Philip, an extraordinary example of the value of marriage, especially marriage in the long, long term. And it's all the more heartbreaking to imagine the Queen now living without her staff and stay. A man not just of great sense of duty, but also an intellectual, a very innovative thinker, somebody who was very unstuffy and unpompous, and a very direct speaker, which was something that you don't always associate with monarchy. But he was an extraordinarily influential figure in the family, the central figure of the family, the kingpin of it, perhaps. And this image of his casket at his funeral, very, very moving. April 2021. He passed away at the age of 99. Because of COVID, it was a very pared down funeral, but still very moving and very dignified. And I covered it for Fox News and was very gratified to see how interested the American public was too, and how sympathetic. You couldn't fail to be sympathetic with this image. The poor Queen, isolated again because of COVID, in the choir stalls in St. George's Chapel in Windsor during the funeral. I think the hearts of not just the British nation, but the world went out to her then. Funeral, of course, also an opportunity for the family to get together, and an opportunity for us, perhaps, to look at some of those who were there and contemplate their future roles in the royal family. Central there, Prince Andrew. Prince Andrew, it's easy to forget today, was very much the pin-up prince. He served in the Royal Navy. He served in combat in the Falklands War in 1982 as a helicopter pilot. And he was very much the glamorous image of the Windsors. Married Sarah Ferguson. They became the Duke and Duchess of York. And sadly, as is now all too well known, after his divorce, Prince Andrew's fortunes, both in terms of his royal duties and his personal life, did not go well. Also much in the news, Prince Harry, and in some senses a parallel story in that Harry was always the glamorous younger brother, the most eligible prince, and when he and Meghan Markle married on the 19th of May, 2018, there was universal celebration. This was considered to be the best thing that had happened to the royal family in decades. A modern, mixed race, new princess, an American, a divorcee. This was a sign that the stuffy old Windsors could move with the times, were moving with the times, and offered an opportunity to rebrand the Windsors as, in many ways, the family that was more relatable to the modern United Kingdom and indeed the modern Commonwealth. I covered that wedding for CNN here with Christian Amanpour. I was outnumbered 3-1 by women, and I was asked what I would advise Princess Meghan. And I thought that I could best sum it up by saying, work hard and keep your head down. And that's the way to earn popularity, to endear yourself to the British people. And I remember Christiane said, "Oh, I do hope not." Well, Christiane was right and I wasn't, because Meghan had her own ideas about her royal role. Here she is with William and Catherine and Prince Harry at the first, and as it turned out, the only gathering of their for the charity that they jointly were patron of, the Royal Foundation. Meghan very enthusiastic about causes such as social justice, women's empowerment, based on her own previous life. And this was something which plainly didn't entirely fit with the pattern that had been intended for the Royal Foundation. It did have the scope to cover almost anything that any of the four wanted to patronize and support. But it was very much a question of teamwork that was not realized, that didn't fulfill its potential. Think of how much good these four working together could have achieved. Unfortunately, for reasons we don't yet fully understand, that ideal outcome was not to be. But Harry and Meghan gave it a good shot. Here they are with the Queen again on the balcony, and in this lovely group photograph to celebrate the baptism of Princess Charlotte. But pretty soon the body language was telling another story, and this was the last time that Harry and Meghan appeared at a public engagement in the UK. This is the 2020 Commonwealth Day service. There'd been a bit of a warning sign, I suppose, when they did an official visit to Ireland, and Meghan gave into the temptation to comment on Irish domestic politics. She felt very strongly, I think, about aspects of Irish abortion law, but the critical thing about the royal family is that it is non-political and resists the temptation to get involved in matters of public policy. And pretty soon, as we know, they had left Britain altogether, gone to Montecito in California, where they gave a famous interview to Oprah Winfrey, which included several damaging allegations, including the accusation that somebody in the royal family was racist. And although I don't think that was a justified comment, it has caused enormous damage. And the role that Harry and Meghan have chosen for themselves in their new Californian life is one that is yet to be fully understood or defined. We can only hope that it leads to happiness for them and obviously happiness with their children. But this is definitely a story that is not yet concluded. It will be fascinating to see if they come to the St. Paul's service next weekend. It'll be wonderful to see them with their family, their extended family, and who knows what good things may come from that. Will the Queen get to meet her great-grandchildren, or her great-granddaughter, Lilibet? She has, of course, met young Archie. Here is one of the most striking images from the funeral of Prince Philip. The Duchess of Cambridge, Catherine, arriving in a mask, because obviously it was during COVID. It's a very arresting image, and I think it's a foretaste of how we can look forward to seeing Catherine when she becomes Queen Consort in the distant future. Their story, much more conventional than Harry's, and appears to be a byword for mutual support and affection, a very happy family, wholesome in every respect, and in many ways the secure, safe hands for the long-term future of the monarchy. Here's an article I wrote praising Prince William's approach to his duties and the fact that he does appear to be so modest, so calm, and avoids inviting us to be sympathetic to him in his royal role. It's often said that being royal is like being born into a prison, that their lives are not their own, that they are set, condemned to a lifetime of duty. And there's some truth in that. But I'm pleased to see that Prince William appears to recognize also the enormous scope it gives him to do good things, and indeed the scope it also leaves him to lead a happy private family life. Harry and William, of course, briefly reunited for the unveiling of this statue to their mother. I mean, I'm no expert in sculpture, but I've got to say I don't like this at all. It doesn't portray the princess I remember, but they commissioned it and hopefully they like it. It's already proved a very popular draw in Kensington Gardens. But to remember also that the Queen's reign is drawing to a close. I think it will be seen by historians in future as the dying days of a glorious age, a golden age, during which the monarchy under Elizabeth, in the shape of Elizabeth, has enjoyed some of its greatest success. And she leaves it in a strong position, widely respected, loved even, but leave it she will. And this is the casket of her mother, and we can expect similar scenes on the sad day when her own funeral takes place. But when that happens, the monarchy will show its remarkable gift for reinvention. There will be a new monarch, and he will be crowned. He will go in this coach to Westminster Abbey, and although it will have endured an extraordinary psychological trauma, the country will rejoice, not necessarily just at the change in reign, but at the fact that once again the country has shown the resilience to enjoy a peaceful and indeed a glorious transfer of reign. The new Queen Consort will be the former Mrs. Camilla Parker Bowles, controversial second wife of Prince Charles, but thanks to some pretty assiduous public relations, now generally agreed to be an acceptable future consort. The prospect of Queen Camilla will please some people. It will worry a few more. The prospect of King Charles is something we've been getting used to for a long time. And here we see him arriving at the recent state opening of Parliament, where he deputised for his mother. And as I mentioned above, the critical question for him will be whether that infallibility that we associate with his mother and the unconditional affection that is shown to his mother, whether those two things will transfer to him. It's important for the future health of the monarchy that they should. Inevitably, because both Prince Charles and Camilla are already of mature years, in historical terms, their reign is likely to be comparatively short. And it will be, I think, fascinating to see whether they change much about the monarchy or whether they continue just to keep a watching brief to preserve all the achievements of Elizabeth II, not least her role as the uncontentious head of state. As head of state, she appears for every new parliament to read what's called the Queen's Speech, written for her by her Prime Minister, remember, her senior advisor, and in that speech, the government, Her Majesty's government, lays out its policy plans for the next session. This is a remarkable photograph. This is actually inside the House of Lords at the state opening of Parliament. In a way, this is the British Constitution played out as a kind of tableau by real people. Remember, of course, the British Constitution does not exist as a single written document, unlike the American Constitution. The British Constitution is a body of laws and precedents and traditions and customs. And here in this ceremony, at the opening of each new session of Parliament, there is a reminder that supreme authority comes from the throne. Now, the throne in this case is empty because the Queen wasn't there because she was suffering mobility problems. So Prince Charles deputised. He did not sit in the throne, but in the pretty grand chair next to it. The crown was there to symbolise the authority of the sovereign. Prince William there to demonstrate the continuity of the monarchy, and the future Queen Camilla also in the picture. In front of them, the Lords, the upper chamber of the British Parliament, the revising chamber, used to be entirely hereditary, but now there are what they call life peers, a few hereditary peers left, and continuing debate about whether or not this house should be elected. There represented the church, the armed forces, the law lords, the British establishment in one place. And also, out of picture here, the commons, the rabble, the representatives of the ordinary people are summoned from the House of Commons. They come to hear the Queen's speech, and they do so with an exaggerated display of disrespect, because they remember, as we do too, that only a few centuries ago, the parliamentarians defeated the monarchy in the Civil War, and that the monarchy really only persists thanks to the goodwill and acquiescence of the Commons. Of course, beyond the United Kingdom, the British monarch is still head of state of a number of realms. That's other countries which are entirely independent in terms of their own governments, but they retain, for reasons very often of constitutional convenience, the British sovereign as their head of state. Here is Prince Charles recently in Canada. And it's interesting when the question comes up of whether or not these realms should retain the sovereign as their head of state, the issue devolves to, well, if you don't want this, what do you want instead? And agreeing what would be better than the sovereign has often proved an impediment to Republican movements in the realms in the past. Prince Philip was very straightforward about this. During an earlier debate about the future of the monarchy in Australia, he said very simply, if it doesn't work for you, get rid of it. Which I think sums up some very long and convoluted constitutional debates. If it doesn't work, get rid of it. And that is something that I think sums up the way in which the future status of the monarchy in the realms will be discussed. The next sovereign will inherit a greatly reduced British Empire. No longer a British Empire, but a British nation with various territories and colonies in other parts of the world. Still, quite a lot of pink there, but they tend to be rather small, but well worth visiting. Tours to the Commonwealth continue. Here are Catherine and William heading off to the Caribbean recently for what turned out to be rather a controversial Jubilee celebration tour. An interesting image this, showing the Queen and Prince Philip in 1966 on the left, and the same Land Rover on the right with William and Catherine. This visit was not uncontroversial. The political mood has changed in a lot of these countries, and although there were a lot of cheers for the Cambridges, there was a degree of politicization of their visit too. And this, I think, is probably a foretaste of more of these sorts of debates and the future role of future sovereigns in the Commonwealth and in the realms and territories. I think that debate has still got some way to run. But ultimately, here is the face of the future of the monarchy, Prince William. We remember the Queen became Queen at the age of 25. For William, it may not be until he is 60 or perhaps even older before he becomes king. So that whatever else about the future of the House of Windsor, we know that future monarchs, certainly for the next 3 monarchs, they're going to be male, they're going to be old, and they're probably going to be bald, which in a youth-obsessed culture is going to be a slightly different and perhaps challenging brand to sell. But with age comes wisdom, we hope, and therefore it is in the hands of Prince Charles, Prince William, and ultimately Prince George too, that the whole question of the future of the British throne now lies. Still though, we enjoy the golden years of Queen Elizabeth. Here she is at the recent Windsor Horse Show pageant, obviously enjoying herself, obviously in good spirits, and since then even carrying out traditional royal duties such as this one, opening the new London Crossrail Underground line, named in her honour the Elizabeth Line. Next time you're in London, go for a ride on it. I gather it's really swish. And we close, as we should, with this lovely portrait of the Queen. I have to say, from my own experience, she wasn't just dutiful and dignified, but also cheerful and very pragmatic. And that's a set of examples that her heirs and successors will struggle to reach. The future of the monarchy is in good hands, so long as the lessons of Queen Elizabeth's reign are learned and the standards she set of impartiality and duty, and it has to be said, dignified silence, are also observed. And next week, when she is with the whole of her family, who knows, there may be some very good things that come from that. Let's hope so. So that not only will the country sing God Save the Queen, in due course, they will happily sing God Save the King. If they do that, then the future of the Windsors will be secure. And there for now, we must leave it. Thank you for letting me share these thoughts, which I hope you found interesting. And I hope that we sail together again in the near future. When we do, we'll look at this subject and others related to it. And if you're interested, next weekend, I'm going to be covering the Queen's Platinum Jubilee for Fox and Friends. So look forward to seeing you then, or when we next sail in Viking. Bye-bye for now.